All right. Good morning, New Life. Before we get started, let's just open up with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you for giving me and Iris this opportunity to talk about your faith and goodness as it relates to house church ministry and our lives. We ask that the Holy Spirit be present in this testimony just as much as it has been present in our lives over the past 3 years. Please send down the Holy Spirit to give us energy and articulation and to calm our hearts as we stand before a large group of people to speak publicly. Please speak truth through us to the congregation, and may this time be a blessing for all who seek it. We love you, we trust you, and we thank you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Okay, so if we could put the verse up on the slides, that'd be good. Today's verse is Matthew 6:31 to 34. It's a pretty ubiquitous verse. So, as Pastor Eric says, ready, begin. So do not worry, saying, "What shall we eat, or what shall we drink, or what shall we wear? For the pagans run after all these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you need them. But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. Therefore, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own."
All right. Good morning, New Life. As Pastor Eric said, my name is Tian, and this is my husband, Edward. He kind of spoiled our intro, but so we're not shepherds. We're just regular members. Our shepherds are Sarah and Andrew Pake, part of Kenya House Church. Oh wait, Pigchaw. They got married when we were gone. Okay, so yeah, Pastor Eric asked us to give a testimony about our experiences related to house church over the last few years. And then we'll begin by giving a brief introduction of where we've been and what we've been doing for the last few years. Then we'll focus on each period of our life. Along the way, we'll testify some of the ways that we have experienced God in our lives, as well as some learnings about house church ministry. So to give some background information, we both attended New Life for about 6 years, starting 2010. And then after meeting each other in 2016 at some sort of retreat, then we got married in 2017 right here on this stage. I moved to Dallas to be with Edward, who had been there already for 1 year for pursuing his master's degree. And then after about 1 year after that, Edward got an internship as well as a follow full-time position in Connecticut. So we moved to the Northeast. After about working for a year, we came back to Houston for another job opportunity, and we've been here since mid-October of last year. Thank you. Yeah, so we'll first talk about our experience in Dallas. Then we'll move to Connecticut and then some reflections. Throughout our testimony, we'll give 9 key lessons that we've learned. But before we get into any of this, I thought it'd be interesting to list out some of the changes that we've noticed since we've been back in Houston. First of all, we spend a lot of time here, but Bel Air Chinatown is no longer under construction. And then 290, it's so big, and it's like basically the new I-10. Seeing and hearing from the new pastors have been really exciting, and the stage, New Life stage, looks amazing. I wish we had this during our wedding. And then the New Life app, never in a million years would we have thought that Pastor Eric would agree to tithing via an app. That's crazy. And then speaking of which, I think Pastor Eric has gotten really funnier. I'm not sure if it's just from time or the sabbatical, but he's been using a lot of props these days. It's really good.
All right. As my wife has already said, my name is Edward. A little bit about me. I'm from the East Coast. While my family moved around a lot early on, we eventually settled down in Connecticut. I came to Houston to attend Rice University. This was in 2010. There, I was introduced to New Life and house church ministry, attended Saigon House Church, shepherded by Ryan Lay, and eventually became a college shepherd as well. After working in Houston for 2 years, I moved to Dallas in 2016 for graduate school. And while this could be a whole other testimony, I just want to emphasize that like my personal experience with house church ministry at New Life has been incredibly positive. So because of this, when I told Pastor Eric I was leaving New Life, I also asked for some suggestions on churches in Dallas that were practicing house church ministry. I'd heard of a few churches that might have been doing something similar, but I figured Pastor Eric would have a better handle on what's going on and where I would fit best. So PE told me about a small church in Dallas called Nouriel Fellowship Church. It turns out that Nouriel was a very small church with about 4 to 5 house churches. Out of those house churches, only one was English speaking. The rest were Korean speaking. Service was in Korean, worship was in Korean, alternating with English. Messages were in Korean with some translation. And I say some because the pastor giving the messages did not slow down for the translator, so the translator was often left in the dust. So, I would hear like bits and pieces of the sermon and try to piece the rest together. So I think it'd be fair to say that I was a little less than enthused about going here. If you can't tell, I'm not Korean, I'm Chinese American, and even my Chinese is terrible, so let alone Korean. And at the time, I didn't understand any Korean, didn't know how to read it, write it, speak it, listen to it. I would need a translator for any time I needed to talk to the pastor or basically most of the congregation. And moving from Houston to Dallas alone, I didn't really know anyone at this church, and I just really wasn't feeling it. But then I get this email from Pastor Eric. I actually dug this up, and I'm quoting it almost word for word. Okay, this is Pastor Eric. Edward. Okay, Edward, I would like to remind you to go to the church I recommended, period. Pastor Eric. That was it. So I respond, yes, Nouriel Fellowship Church, right? That church is doing house church ministry very sincerely, and I think God will use you in a special way if you go there and serve humbly. And this is my response. Listen carefully. Oh, okay, thanks for the heads up. I will try my best to go there. Okay, so I cringed when I read this email. If you're a shepherd, even if you're not a shepherd, you probably know what try my best means. Have you ever heard someone say, oh yeah, I'll try my best to be there, I'll try my best to do that? It means nothing, right? It means, yeah, I really don't want to do this, but maybe I'll do it if God works a miracle in my heart, right? So even though I was a difficult sheep for Pastor Eric in this email, I did end up committing to obeying him and only going to Nouriel Fellowship Church and never visiting any other churches. As you'll soon see, this turns out to actually be a really big blessing for me and Iris. However, even before we talk about being blessed through service and things like that, and what kinds of plans God had for me, I first want to talk about something else. When I first attended house church there, our one English-speaking house church, which was a young adult house church shepherded by Gloria Kim, the pastor's daughter. She's single at the time with a high-intensity job. She still served as a house church shepherd alone, hosted house church every week, was Sunday service worship leader, was the translator for messages, English Bible study instructor for all of the English congregation, which was her house church. She attended early morning prayer every Friday and still manages to find time to pour out love to her sheep through things like care packages, Christmas gifts, and more. At the time, she was such an inspiration for us in terms of loving the church sacrificially. However, it's also pretty clear that this is too much. And if nothing changed, I have no doubt that Gloria would have faced burnout and hardship. So this leads into our first learning. When God calls you to a specific environment, don't just look for how your own prayers are going to be answered. It may also be beneficial for you to see if you've been called there to be someone else's answered prayer. So let me say that again. When God calls you to a specific environment, don't just look for how your own prayers may be answered. It may also be beneficial for you to see if you've been called there to be someone else's answered prayer. So when I first identified that there was prayer to be answered at the church, and that God was giving me an opportunity to be a part of that answered prayer, there came this wellspring of energy and motivation. It wasn't like some sort of spike or a spike of energy or something. It was more like a slow-moving, enduring force that continually drove me to ministry, carrying me like a current in a large river. I don't really know how to put it into words. Like I was struggling right there because it doesn't come naturally to me. I think naturally I'm a lazy person at heart. You'll often find me trying to like analyze and figure out how to do things more efficiently, and this is mostly driven by my desire to not do more work than is necessary. So the only thing I can say for sure in this situation is that this feeling of like diligence was not something that came naturally to me. And I repeatedly find that it only happens when it comes to ministry and serving God. So I went on to serve at Nouriel as a house church shepherd, helping to divide up house church serving responsibilities, hosting, as well as going through multiplication. The head pastor also asked me to start an English service where I would be giving sermons on Sunday. We started a sports ministry playing badminton in the gym, as well as a weekly game night that we hosted in our small apartment as an opportunity to reach out to VIPs and more. When I was writing this testimony and reminded of all the stuff that we did in those 2 years, it was kind of mind-blowing. I almost actually didn't want to write most of it because it seems unbelievable, even to me who like actually lived through it. However, I'm absolutely sure that I was not able to do these things by my own power, but rather that God was able to do them through me, and all I did was reap the benefits.
So since Edward gave a brief introduction, I'll follow his lead. I grew up in Southern California, so the opposite side of where he grew up, and then moved to Houston right after graduating high school, and then just to be with my mom. And I attended U of H, and during my senior year, I became co-shepherd of a U of H house church. And afterwards, I started my job as an elementary school teacher. This is around the time that I met Edward, and then right before he moved to Dallas. So when I found out that he was going to Nouriel Church, the Korean-speaking church in Dallas, I was pretty worried for him, but I also admired that he obeyed his pastor and was willing to commit, even though to me, it didn't seem like such a good idea. So it turns out God indeed had greater plans for him during this time. Nouriel was really small, but I think it was really good that it was small because it's very tight-knit. And for example, the whole church would just go to the pastor's house for New Year's celebration. Many members couldn't speak English, but they were still able to create like a welcoming environment for him. And it's really easy to just pour out love and care in a small church, I feel like, even with language barrier. They really treated us like family, and there were so many ministry opportunities, maybe because it was a smaller church. And then God definitely had one prepared for Edward. He mentioned that the pastor asked him to give sermons. Like, I knew he was smart, like he went to Rice, and he's a pretty good public speaker, but he's no pastor. Edward was really hesitant on taking the position at first because he mentioned in the Bible that it says, teachers of God's words are judged more strictly. And God still surprised us. Edward gave a sermon about 2 to 3 times a month, and I thought they were really good. Maybe I'm biased. To be honest, for the majority of college, I didn't realize it at the time, but I was a pretty bad listener during sermons. A lot of Pastor Eric's messages just went like whoop over my head. And I realized this because early on in our relationship, Edward, during conversation, would refer to some sort of message that Pastor Eric gave, and I'd be like, oh, yeah, I don't really remember that. Maybe because the congregation was smaller in Dallas. Maybe it's because Edward catered the messages to address issues for like specific young adults, but the messages were a really good, a big blessing. And as like a member of the congregation, I could say that everyone really enjoyed them, and I remember at least half of them. Especially when Edward first started giving the sermons, which was before we were even engaged. I listened to the message every time I visited Dallas, and I tried to time it so that I could listen to it. And I felt like a confirmation from God just while he was speaking that I'm going to marry the right man. Looking back now, it seemed like we were just going through so much. Like after I moved up to Dallas, and um, I had work, he had grad school. We had people at our apartment like every week for the game night and then hosting, and just that was like our first year of marriage. But it all seemed very like doable at the time. For example, for grad school for Edward, I never saw him studying. Like, I never saw him studying. Like, I don't even know what classes he took. I barely knew the major. But I never questioned it. I just assumed he was super smart and just his classes were easy.
Okay, so before I keep going, I just want to say for the record that grad school is not easy. It wasn't easy, but I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So back on the topic of serving and being blessed through serving, I think teaching and giving sermons is actually a very practical example that teaches us about how God blesses us. And also it's a practical example both in and outside of Christianity. When I tutored economics concepts at Rice, my tutoring sessions helped me strengthen my own foundations. And when I served as a youth Bible study teacher at New Life, I also learned a lot just by teaching the materials. Also, like in youth, they're learning like all of these biblical concepts and stuff that I never got exposed to when I was in youth, so there was that as well. But this is my next takeaway from the last 3 years. If you've ever asked for blessings in your prayers, if you've ever asked to be built up or to gain wisdom, God will answer by giving you opportunities to serve. So I'll say that again. If you've ever asked for blessings in prayer, if you've ever asked to be built up or to gain wisdom, God will answer by giving you opportunities to serve. So it only makes sense that when I started giving sermons on Sundays, I also got a lot out of it. At first, I was really worried that I would either not know what to teach, not speak about it well, or maybe teach the wrong thing. But thankfully, I actually listened to Pastor Eric's sermons throughout my time in college, so I had a lot of inspiration to draw from. You're welcome. I still refer to the lessons in my own messages for strength in my life. For example, one of the messages I gave was about joy as one of the fruit of the Spirit, and I related joy to headwinds and tailwinds. The gist is that headwinds are winds that blow against you, and in the context of the sermon, I was like talking about biking, and so headwinds are winds that blow against you, and then tailwinds are winds that blow in the same direction as where you're going. And psychologically, humans are wired to notice and dwell on headwinds. And we're also really bad at acknowledging any tailwinds that help us. We're good at noticing what's wrong around us because that's how we survive, by improving and taking care of what's wrong. But in the same way, in life, we're really good at noticing the stuff that brings us down and not acknowledging the things that lift us up. This is why it's really important to do things like periodically think about what you're thankful for, which we do in house church. Sermons like this one helped remind me to choose joy in my life, even when things seemed like they were spiraling out of control, which is what I'm going to talk about next. So during our time in Dallas, something else happened that we'd like to share about. Not long after Iris moved up, she started to have some stomach pain. And to give some context, while we were dating, she had a few bouts of indigestion. So this wasn't that out of the ordinary. Only this time, it seemed worse, and it lasted longer. Iris' side of the family doesn't believe in doctors, and my side has people in the medical field. I generally left it alone. It seemed pretty harmless for the most part. Like my mother-in-law would give me royal jelly ice cubes to gargle, which, by the way, those are gross. And then, I might like drink some blended pear if my throat was sore or something. But this time was different. Iris was bedridden for several days. And again, I figured maybe it was just a really bad case of indigestion. However, during a house church that we were hosting, one of our house church members thought out loud that it might be appendicitis. And when I heard that, my brain went into high gear, like panic mode. Usually, if you have appendicitis, I'm thinking the pain is so excruciating that you can't easily move around. I think one of the signs that they teach is that like if you have appendicitis, you can't jump because of how much it hurts. Meanwhile, Iris is bedridden, but she still gets up to do things like wash dishes for house church. So I was like, it couldn't be appendicitis, right? Then I was reminded of a story that Iris once told me. During a trip to Korea, she got her wisdom teeth extracted. During the first extraction, after they injected the anesthesia and waited, they started operating, and Iris was like, wait, I can still feel everything, and she panicked. And so the oral surgeon decided to play it safe and do another round. And after that round, as they started, Iris was again like, wait, I can feel everything. So they did it one more time, same result, and then they were like, nah, you're being a baby, right? And they kept going. And Iris cried the whole time. It hurt really badly, but they just kind of ignored her. Then the next day, they did the second extraction, and everything was fine. Like, she didn't feel anything, and she wasn't being a baby at all. So she wasn't being a baby the first time either. So that's when I came to the realization of two things. One, my wife probably has like an absurdly high pain tolerance, right? That's ridiculous. It was like an impacted wisdom tooth. And then two, this could really be appendicitis, in which case if it ruptured, it'd be fatal within hours. Iris really didn't want to go to a hospital, but after much convincing, she agreed to consider going in the morning. That night, I remember I couldn't sleep. Instead, I kept praying. And while I was praying, I don't know if I would call it a vision, but I had a very vivid image in my head that I would wake up the next morning and Iris's body would be cold. It must have been around 2 in the morning when I made the decision, and I woke up Iris and took her straight to the emergency room. There, the doctors did a CT scan, diagnosed her with a ruptured appendix, and rushed her for surgery. I know hindsight is 20/20, but I'm still kicking myself thinking about how long it took for me to take action. Also, big retrospective shout out for Iris for still trying to do the dishes for house church while literally having appendicitis. Let no one bring into question her passion for God or house church ministry. But back to a more serious note, throughout the whole hospital experience, Iris was terrified. This was her first time in a hospital since she was born. When the nurses brought her bed to the small waiting area outside the surgery wing, she was so out of touch with modern medicine that she legit asked if this was where the surgery was going to happen. I couldn't help but laugh, while the nurses patiently explained that this was a changing area before surgery and that the surgery room is much more spacious and sterile. Watching her go through the double doors was so scary. When I was by her side, I kept encouraging her, explaining what was going on and comforting her, but as the bed rolled away, the thought crossed my mind that this might be the last time I saw her alive.
So I'm alive. Don't worry. During house church, we just happened to host that week. I was definitely in great pain, but all I could hear in my head was Pastor Eric's voice saying, "Don't skip house church unless you're on your deathbed." So we continued to have house church. Thankfully, Edward cooked dinner, and he handled most of it. But when he was busy with some other stuff, I just did the dishes. So yeah, I survived surgery, and thankfully, my appendix was actually just not ruptured. It just looked like it through the scans because of how badly infected it was, and probably just because of how long we waited to go. But on a lighter note, I really enjoyed being at the hospital. I got to lie down most of the time. The bed was adjustable. I had a nurse and painkillers at the call of a button. There was a TV in front of me the whole time. And then, this is really silly, but I ate pudding for the first time after the surgery, and it was really good. And if it wasn't for the pain or the worry of just medical bills coming in, I think it would have just felt like a really good staycation. And then during this time, our house church in Dallas, the members visited a lot, and they brought me food and just stayed with us and just hung out with us. And it reminded me in times like this, it's really good to have a house church. We didn't have any family members in Dallas at the time, so without house church and the other church members, we would have had to go through this all alone. So I survived appendicitis, but then the medical bills came in. We were worried about the cost of the bills because the surgery happened to occur the 1 month I did not have insurance in that year. It was after I was covered by my employer in Houston, and then it was before I was covered by my employer in Dallas. And so I thought, like, hey, nothing will happen in this month. It's fine if I don't have insurance. But then, yeah, that happened. So we did some initial research on the cost of appendicitis, an appendectomy without insurance, and the range was between $5,000 and $50,000. Needless to say, our house church prayer for the next few weeks was for that cost to be at the lower end of the range. When the bills finally all came in, the total was at the complete opposite end of the range. I remember a sinking feeling when we opened the letter and saw all of the digits. It was a little over $50,000. And thankfully, Edward stayed really calm. We were like right outside our apartment, just opening the letter. And he said something very Edward-like, oh, it's gonna be okay, we'll figure it out. God will take care of us. And I'm just like, oh, this is a lot of money. But for the next year, we spent time applying for financial aid and bill forgiveness programs and negotiating down all of the individual bills and just calling people, sending in bank statements and proof of no insurance, and then mainly just writing letters for the applications. I'm very thankful that Edward took care of most of it, and with some advice from his mom, who's in the medical field, we worked on it. And so if it wasn't for him, I think I would have still been in debt. Actually, if it wasn't for him, I probably would have died from indigestion. During this time, Edward wasn't working. He was making negative income as a grad student, and I was working as an elementary school teacher. And so I was reluctant, but we continued to tithe. To be fair, 10% is a very small number, or 10% of a small number is even a smaller number, and I still had hard time tithing that, especially with the looming medical bills over my head. But again, we just remembered Pastor Eric. He always talked about tithing, and he even talked about it during our wedding ceremony. So we continued to tithe. After we finished negotiating all of the individual bills down, and then when it was all said and done, the total medical bill after every account was closed ended up being just a little bit more than $5,000, which is 10% of the original bill. To give context to our financial situation at the time, even the $5,000 was a pretty big debt in our bank account, let alone anything near the original amount. And looking back now, God was really faithful to us in our prayer request. And the thing is, we knew God is all-powerful and faithful to his sheep, but that didn't change the fact that we were worried or had doubts. This was the next lesson that we learned. To have faith doesn't mean that we live without doubt or worry. Faith is demonstrated by what our actions are during these times of doubt and worry. When we act in faith, especially when everything around us screams not to, God protects us. This lesson followed us into Connecticut and even now. And lastly, God doesn't always answer your prayer requests the way that you envision him to. In this case, it was because God had a bigger plan for us. Just imagine if the original bill just came in at $5,000. We'd pay it off, mention it as a praise report in house church, and that'd be the end of it. Instead, our faith was tested, God protected us, and our faith became stronger as a result.
As Iris mentioned, I somehow managed to get all of my graduate school work done throughout this, maintaining a strong GPA through my time at UT Dallas. I would like to point out that it wasn't a magical thing. I hung out with Iris during the day because this was like our first year of marriage. And then when she went to sleep, I got back up and did my grad school work. That's why she didn't see any of it. I wasn't just twiddling my thumbs while God like wrote out all my problem sets and papers. I actually took a lot of pride in my schoolwork, both at Rice as well as in grad school. Not just a lot of pride. I would say I took too much pride in my schoolwork. But God had a funny way of knocking me down a peg. So as a part of my graduation requirements, my master's program required me to get an internship. And this internship would count as credits towards my graduation. I started applying for internships in the fall of my second year, and my approach is like to applying for jobs is just, it's a numbers game. So each job I apply to is like a data point. Did I get an interview? Did I get a response, or did they reject me? And then every job opening has like hundreds, if not thousands, of applicants. So you'd be lucky if like you got yours even looked at by a human. And then this would overall, after a lot of applications, kind of give me an idea of my market value. So if I wanted to get enough data points, I'd have to apply to a lot of positions. At first, I was a little bit selective about what I was applying to, but as time dragged on and I got more rejections, I started lowering my expectations. Over 3 months, I think I applied to about at least 120 internships. And so by the end of January, out of those 120 data points, I heard back from 3. Out of 3, I was rejected from 1 during the interview, or after. They didn't, like, in the middle of the interview, like, no. So I was rejected after. The second one, I rejected myself because it was not an accurate job description. And then the last one was the internship I ended up accepting and going to Connecticut. Would you guys like to guess where this internship ranked out of my 120 applications? It was the number 1 spot. It checked all of the boxes for everything I wanted in an internship, and I literally couldn't ask for more in this opportunity. To me, God was flexing, and he was asking me, do you think you got that job all by yourself? You know, if you got rejected from all these other jobs that were way worse, and this is the one that you got accepted to, do you think that was you? And throughout the rest of my time in grad school, as well as during my time in the internship, and even afterwards, during my full-time work, I received a steady stream of rejection emails from all the other positions I applied to. Not one of them contacted me for any kind of follow-up other than to say, nah, like, we're good, even though they were worse than the one that God provided for me. I got emails that told me I was rejected for a summer internship after that summer had already passed. So every one of these emails served as a humble reminder to me of this next lesson. I did not earn my position. Rather, God has given me tools, talents, and opportunities. More importantly, he can just as easily take all of them away. We are all dispensable, and we need to keep that humble reminder in our hearts. I'll say that again. I did not earn my position. Rather, God has given me tools, talents, and opportunities. More importantly, he can just as easily take all of them away. We are all dispensable.
So we planned to move to Connecticut even before Edward got the full-time offer, and that was really stressful to me. And then Connecticut in general, the Northeast in general, was entirely new to me. When I moved from Southern California to Houston, the weather was like somewhat similar. And then when I moved to Dallas, I thought, whoa, this is true winter. Dallas was really cold. And then now we're moving to Connecticut. That's a whole nother level. For example, I thought that I would have to get those special snowshoes that looked like tennis rackets at the bottom. They wore those shoes in the movie The Day After Tomorrow, where it's like a snow apocalypse. And then to add on further, I wasn't sure what I was going to do about work. Do I continue to pursue teaching in Connecticut? And then lastly, but most importantly, for the first time in years, house church wasn't going to be a part of our lives. House church was such a big part of our lives, and that's what really transformed us while living in Houston. And then we asked Pastor Eric if he knew of any churches in Connecticut that did house church ministry, but the closest one was 2 hours away in Boston. And so it was really hard moving away from Dallas. I didn't realize it, but over the short course of 1 year, I really grew close to our Dallas church family. On one hand, it's amazing what 1 year can do in house church ministry, but on the other hand, it really sucked saying goodbye to people I've grown really close to. But with great hesitation and a lot of uncertainty, we moved to Connecticut.
So since I grew up in Connecticut, I knew of a sister church to my home church that we occasionally did stuff with, located in Hartford, which is where we were at. However, I decided that since Iris was making this move for me, and she wasn't used to moving around often, it would be better for us to go to a brand new church for both of us. Visiting a Korean church would also probably be a good idea. Iris nearly fainted when she checked on Google Maps and saw that the closest H Mart was in another state. There's no H Mart in Connecticut. So we were hoping maybe she can get a little taste of home from some kind of Korean church. During our time long distance, when I was at my internship, I did a Google search and found a small church to visit. It was a quick 10-minute drive from our place, and walking into English service, I saw that there was passion in worship. I saw many serving opportunities. For example, the English pastor was leading worship with one other church member, and that was it. I also felt a very tight-knit community, similar to the church that we attended in Dallas. The icing on the cake was that they served delicious Korean food for Sunday lunch. Everyone was very welcoming. I felt like we clicked right away. And they were so welcoming, in fact, that one of the members provided a list of other churches in the area for us to go visit to if we wanted, including another Korean church that they were originally a part of, but then the Korean congregation side went through a split. The English congregation had a few older couples that could serve as mentors for us, but they also had quite a few young adults, college age and immediately post-grad, so we could serve them as well. I basically thought like all the boxes were checked, and I made up my mind that we're going to attend this church. Then, for some reason, I felt a nudge to go visit another church. Why? I have no idea. I didn't do that in Dallas. I thought, just one more church, so I can, say to Iris that I tried looking around before I decided on this one. So I took the list that church member gave me, and I picked the first one on the list. First Korean Presbyterian Church. This turned out to be the church that they had split from. The English congregation side is called Covenant Chapel, or CC. Walking into Covenant Chapel, I already had my mind set on the first church that I'd gone to. This one was farther away. It was across the river. Yes, there's like a river that runs through Hartford. It was a bigger church. The pastor did not have any other serving roles during service, so things seemed okay. People were a little less welcoming, to be honest. And on paper, everything said that the first church I went to was the one I should be going to. Then, that one Sunday that I ended up visiting, during the sermon, the pastor starts talking about, the value of fellowship, vulnerability, accountability, and community. He starts talking about starting these smaller groups of people in the church that would meet outside in their houses on a day other than Sunday. These groups would regularly meet, and the emphasis would be on sharing, not Bible study. He kept talking, and the more he kept talking about it, the more I was like, this sounds really familiar. And at the end of the big reveal, I was like, he's going to say house church. He's like, this is basically house church. And then his last slide says, growth groups, starting like next month or something. I was like, growth groups? What is that? After service, I met up with Pastor Fred, and I get talking with him in the line for food. And I'm like, hey man, your growth groups sound a lot like this thing my old church in Houston did called house church. And it turns out Pastor Fred has read the house church book by Pastor Chai and has visited a church down in Orlando that does house church ministry. And growth groups was like a derivative of that. He was trying to transition into house church. Not only that, but when we sat down to eat, some guy sitting next to the pastor immediately turns to me and goes, hey, I hear you're part of Texas. What part? Well, I just came from Dallas, but I spent most of my time in Houston. He goes, Houston? You ever heard of a church called New Life? I had a big smile on my face. I'm like, New Life? Dude, I went to that church for 6 years. Turns out, another New Lifer was attending this church by the name of Anthony Min with his wife Janice and their baby son Caleb. They were also attending Covenant Chapel. They used to be in Tony and Judy's house church, and then he recognized me from my brief, embarrassing stint as an announcements guy for service. Hopefully, no one remembers me from that time, but according to the laughter, people do remember. But seriously, though, think about it. What are the chances? What are the chances that flying to a random state, I visit a church that on that Sunday announces a plan to begin some kind of derivative of house church? This was the church that God called me to go to and serve. So what if I had ignored that nudge to go visit another church, to leave my comfort zone? What if I had walked into CC and immediately left, figuring, this isn't what I was comfortable with in terms of a church that I could go serve at? So this was my next learning. What the Spirit asks of you is not always logical. In fact, it will sometimes look illogical, simply because we don't have the same kingdom perspective. I generally act on logic. You can ask Iris. We have this joke that when I start saying things in a very logical order, she'll respond with beep boop, beep boop, because I'm kind of like a robot. So this learning hit me pretty hard. So I'm going to say it one more time. What the Spirit asks of you is not always logical. In fact, it will sometimes look illogical simply because we do not have the same kingdom perspective that God has.
So here are some observations that we made while attending the church. The church was small enough that it was difficult to get the resources and manpower to get a lot of things done. But at the same time, the church was large enough that you could avoid accountability if you wanted to. Also, many of the members were people who had spent their whole lives at that church. They were born there, they grew up there. And then many of the members were also related to other members in some way. Lastly, we observed that the church had a few strong core members that touched every aspect of ministry, as well as a group of members who were just coming to church on Sundays, and that's probably it. This isn't a criticism of Covenant Chapel. This is a common trait that we've seen in almost every church we've visited. And then, by the way, for the rest of the testimony, if we say growth group, we mean house church in Connecticut. It couldn't be confusing, but we were confused the whole time as well. In terms of starting growth group, the initial structure was not ideal, and Covenant Chapel divided the church into 3 groups because that's how many shepherds or couples stepped up. These groups were large, and they were supposed to meet just once a month on a Saturday. During this time, our growth group was led by 2 single guys, and they were involved in church a lot too. And then while we observed, we were careful not to step on any toes of our pastor or of our leaders, but rather just give them feedback over time to help inform their decisions for the future. The difficulties we faced served as a helpful way of highlighting why house church is structured the way it is. We found that while growth groups were good, it wasn't as effective as house church. Meeting once a month meant that you didn't have a lot of time to talk, and you had a lot of surface level things just to catch people up about. You're just sharing what was on your calendar the last month, and then just updating people. And you don't naturally get driven into deeper sharing that way. And then meeting once a month also meant that it wasn't prioritized in people's calendars. For us at New Life, we never schedule anything on Friday nights, or hopefully most of us, because we know house church is on Friday night, and with almost no exceptions. But for the first few months of our time in Connecticut, Friday just crept up on us. After the work week, we didn't know what to do. We're like, oh, it's Friday today? And we didn't have anywhere to go. We didn't plan anything. I think some of you might have experienced the same thing recently when if your house church was moved to Saturday for hosting a lay leader seminar. We eventually filled our Friday nights by serving in youth ministry and dabbling here and there in college ministry too. Another issue that CC had was that it was starting from scratch. It didn't have the momentum that New Life has. What I mean is, when someone becomes a new shepherd here, they have a lot of mentors or people to look up to and model after. But in CC, they didn't have anyone. We realized that when churches start house church from scratch, they have no one to model after. And that was kind of I knew it, but I never really thought about that. Just knowing what to do as a shepherd is very different from seeing what a shepherd actually does. Even more specifically, no one at CC has ever attended house church seminar, not even our pastor. One thing the house church ministry does well is that it effectively separates different priorities for the church. Like house church ministers to our heart, and then Sunday worship ministers to our soul or our will, and then the weekday Bible study is for our minds or intellects. We found that without this clear philosophy of distinction, things would happen like people would want to mix Bible study in with growth group. But then by doing that, you're like diluting the effectiveness of both house church and Bible study. Right now, I'm being pretty critical of how growth group started, but at the same time, it was really good. I think it's because I'm sharing it from my perspective. While we saw all the bad sides, the members of Covenant Chapel, they felt like they had a breath of fresh air. Some had shared that they never experienced dedicated time to fellowship outside of Sunday worship, and that growth group was really nice. It just blew us away, realizing how few structured opportunities many churches have for close fellowship, and specifically deep and vulnerable sharing. If your only opportunity to fellowship is after Sunday service, there's no room for deep sharing. And if you're like in line for food, someone asks, "Oh, how's your week?" or "How are you doing?" Like they're not expecting a 1-hour deep dive into your personal life and all your struggles. At best, they'll be like, "Oh yeah, it's pretty good. How are you?" And you go back and forth. But for the most part, it's like, "Oh yeah, everything's good. Everything's good." That's just how small talk works, right? And then so after some time of observation, this was around December that we became shepherds for our growth group. One leader just happened to move to California, and then so we stepped up. And our first goal was to build growth group into the vision of house church with the permission of our pastor. And we decided to meet more often. And even if it meant less people came out, we just wanted to build that consistency and just to let people know that, hey, we're always here. Our hope was that by meeting often, a few things would happen, that people would be more consistent, and number two, that people would be more comfortable with one another and build that trust and bond. And number three, that people would just run out of surface level things to talk about and prompt them to share more deeply. One other difficult thing that we faced was the size of our growth group. It was really hard to keep people accountable. The growth group started off with 30 people in our chat. That's a lot of people. But weekly attendance averaged around like 16 to 15 people. Another difficulty in getting house church started was that people weren't used to meeting weekly outside of Sundays. Like people have a hard time coming to church on Sundays on a weekly basis. How are we expecting to come out another day? But I think it was especially hard because a lot of the core members also volunteered for youth that was on Friday nights. And so after just talking about it a lot, we decided that we're going to host growth group every Thursday night because people were kind of more lenient about being tired on Friday. Because any other day of the week, I feel like is not a good time for a house church. Like Sunday through Thursday, you have work the next day. Saturday night, you have church the next day. And so Friday is, we realized like why house church is on Friday. And then during this time, we hosted, we cooked meals, we organized icebreakers, we prepared praise and word time, and then we facilitated the house church sharing and prayer.
So throughout this time, life was kind of a struggle. Many of you might be able to relate in terms of how drained you feel if you had various things that got in the way, and like travel, and then you just didn't have house church for a while. And if you missed several house churches at once, sometimes you don't even realize it, but once you actually attend a house church, you feel this like release or rejuvenation, like you're refreshed again, right? We felt this way, like this drained feeling, because no one was brave enough to openly share deeply during this time. Iris and I tried our best to model vulnerable sharing, but nothing was coming out. So this went on for months. We stayed in the baby stages of house church. No one was available to host, so we hosted every growth group. Some members wanted to help, but they were members we knew were already overloaded with other ministry roles. And Gloria, our friend in Dallas, who hosted every house church before we came, served as an inspiration for us. So by this time, it didn't feel impossible. With the vision of what growth group was and what it could be, we pressed on and continued to shepherd our sheep. Over time, our growth group started to get more consistent. People started showing up out of nowhere that we'd never met before, but apparently they had gone to CC all their lives. Like Iris said, people appreciated having a time of fellowship. Still, there was no true deep sharing. As growth groups continued on, I implemented a prayer request spreadsheet to more closely track our members' prayer requests over time. Later on, I started messaging our members in the middle of the week to remind them of their own prayer requests and to check in to see on how they're doing. I found that our members really appreciated this and started taking their prayer requests much more seriously, not just throwing out all their wants, but targeting specific requests that were tangible and aligned with God's will, because they knew I would be following up with them. More than that, these things enabled me to pray more effectively for my members. So on August 22nd, 2019, after about 8 months of shepherding, we had a breakthrough. One of our members cried during sharing, which then became the start for others to start sharing deeply as well. It seems weird to celebrate when someone cries and reveals suffering or brokenness. Like, it seems silly, right, that we're just expecting everyone to have problems and break down and cry in front of us. But in reality, this world is broken and full of sin. And if you really think about it, it's actually more absurd to assume that everyone's life is all put together in every aspect: community, family, finances, faith, marriage, kids, health, future. That Satan can attack any of these things in your life. And I remember PE said this at some kind of house church thing. I don't really remember what it was. Maybe it was like shepherd's training. He said, the revealing of feeling is the beginning of healing. So when a member cries in house church for the first time, or when a member reveals frustration, suffering, emptiness, any other kind of darkness in their life, we're not relishing in their suffering or what's plaguing them. We're celebrating because in that moment, when they were able to share openly, they showed us a sign that there was hope for healing through the Spirit. That, before they were dead while they were breathing, but once they opened up and they revealed their feeling, we knew that they were alive. So afterwards, things started to click for our growth group. Members began to see exactly how valuable house church was, to have that deep fellowship, loving accountability, and to enable healing in our lives. So why did it take so long for deep sharing to come out? And when it did, why did it suddenly happen with multiple members of our house church, of our growth group? We could say that it takes a long time for everyone to get comfortable, or it took a long time for members to get consistent and get used to the structure of house church. Maybe we're impatient, and maybe the time that it took was a totally normal time. But I think, in retrospect, that I focused a lot of my early efforts on doing the things that needed to be done during house church, kind of like Martha, right? Things like cooking food, leading praise, preparing word time, focusing on fellowship. And only later on did I spend more time and more effort on prayer and relying on the Holy Spirit. So my personal theory and takeaway from this experience is as follows. Inspiring transformation in an established church requires members witnessing the transformation of peers or other incumbent members through the Holy Spirit. So this is what I mean. When our growth group members met us, we had already gone through that transformation at New Life. When we served in Connecticut, I think it's really easy for people who didn't know us to look at us and think, well, that's just who Edward and Iris are. They're like superhumans or something. In order to inspire transformational change in our members, it takes prayer and the Holy Spirit. It takes a supernatural power to inspire and transform another member of the church, someone whom everyone else has known for years, who doesn't normally act this way. And then when that person transforms, it serves as a catalyst to inspire others to think, how are they able to change after all this time? And if they can do it, why can't I? So this is why we have things like Lay Leader Seminar, so we can get connected to those who serve in other churches and show them the vision of house church and pray for them for transformational change. This is why shepherds are called to pray for their house church at least 4 times a week. And I realize now that Pastor Eric is being very lenient with his minimum. If I could do it all over again, I would start by praying for transformation for our house church members more, and I would worry much less about how house church actually goes on the day of.
So just like in Dallas, we had some troubles with money. Instead of just one large debt, we had many little things that just came up that was really hard to pay off. And so I took Abundant Life here, and maybe I should remember more from that class. But Edward handles most of our finances. No, he handles everything. And then, so even though I wasn't looking constantly, I knew we were slowly just spending more than we were making. But at the same time, Edward didn't He wasn't stingy about our money when it came towards ministry and serving and hosting. I think that during this time, he would get really stressed out and like lose sleep over it. I wouldn't know because I like fell asleep really fast, but he told me the next morning like, oh, I couldn't sleep. And so during this time we had not a lot coming in because I wasn't working, and my prayer request for the majority of last year was to get a job, and then I finally did, but it was just like a temp position and I wasn't making a lot of money. And then so, do you want to talk about me?
Yeah. So in September, I was considering making some uncomfortable decisions to reduce our spending, like possibly moving to a different apartment that was farther away from everything. And then I got a call from a good friend at New Life named Nathan Chang, who was considering me for a job at his company. Honestly, we weren't sure about taking the job. It was better pay. It was in Houston, where there's cheaper cost of living. Yes, it's where New Life was, and we have friends there. But at the same time, we had worked so hard to get Growth Group going, and we had just had that big breakthrough a few months ago. We were concerned that by leaving, everything would collapse. All of that work would be for nothing. But like I said before, we're all dispensable. We were prideful and arrogant again, thinking that anything relied on us, and God showed us that. For example, when we joined youth ministry, everyone celebrated because Iris was female, and they had no female teachers. And so until then, it was 5 young adult guys trying to stay afloat without a youth pastor. And Iris was really concerned that the youth girls were no longer going to have an older sister when we left. But while we were deliberating on the offer, 2 ladies in our growth group decided to step up for youth ministry. Furthermore, after we had talked to our growth group about moving back to Houston, many of our members started stepping up, volunteering to host, dividing up serving roles, even becoming shepherds. More importantly, when we told our pastor that we were leaving, we were able to convince him to go to House Church Seminar for Pastors, which is coming up, and to send lay leaders to the seminar for lay leaders. And it was good to see our Connecticut friends when they came, and we had good conversations with them about house church ministry. I think we were the crutches to help our growth group stand, but now that their leg is healed, the crutch only makes them weak. They rely on us, they depend on us, and they kind of assume that we're the support net. As we left Connecticut, we saw a picture of the growth group with their new shepherds at someone else's place, and they looked more like a real house church than at any other point when we had been shepherds. Okay. All right, so coming back to Houston, this is the last part. Sorry, we're running a little over. Looking back, it's actually pretty funny. We had gone through the valley while we were in Dallas, right, with the appendectomy, and God was by our side then. And we barely made it with a small positive balance in our bank account. And here we are again in Connecticut, stressing as we basically go through the same exact valley again. And we make it out with very little left in our bank account, but we're still in the positive. Of course, God was going to move in some way. We were just scared and impatient. And we were so focused on the present, we forget to remember God's faithfulness in the past. I feel like now I understand better the Israelites in the book of Judges when they keep losing their faith in God time and time again. So because of this, my takeaway is this. God is faithful. Never forget that God is faithful. He may not be doing things the way you envision it. He may not be moving on your time, but in the end, he's always faithful. So now we're here. We're back in Houston, back at New Life. Some things picked up very quickly, as if we never left. Sometimes too quickly. Like, for example, when we went to fall retreat, this was the second weekend we were back. I didn't know it until the first small group, but I was made a small group leader. And when Pastor Eric asked us to give a testimony about our experiences, my first thought was who would actually care if they didn't know us? Even when we first started writing this, I had the thought that everyone was going to be super bored because of all these random details in our lives, especially for those of you who don't really know us. But we learned that it's important to obey your pastor as well as your shepherds, and because God put them in your life for a reason. It's pretty simple. If we didn't obey Pastor Eric, we wouldn't have any of this. Where would our lives have been if we didn't obey PE to go to Nouriel in Dallas? What would happen to our marriage, my grades, my career? If I didn't obey our head pastor in Dallas in giving sermons, where would we be if we didn't obey PE in telling us to tithe no matter where we were financially? What would have happened if we didn't obey PE in terms of giving this testimony? I'm really thankful that we gave this testimony. Yeah. Okay, so one final thought before we end. Since moving back, many of you have been asking us if it feels like we've come home, and if everything just went right back into the swing of things. It's true, Houston used to be our home. It's where we studied, it's where we became working adults, it's where we built a relationship with Jesus, it's where we got married. Houston has a special place in our hearts, and it was home for a long time. But God called us to Dallas, and we built a home there. And when God called us to leave, it was hard. And then when he called us to move to Connecticut, we built a home there as well. And when God called us to leave, again, it was the hardest. Coming back to Houston wasn't easy either. And if he calls us to go elsewhere again in a few years, it'll be tough, but we'll go through the doors that God presents us and opens for us, because at the end of the day, there's no place here on earth that is truly our home. However, with the experience that we gained from the past 3 years, we're now comforted with our final lesson, and this is where we're going to end. It's this: wherever there is kingdom work to be done and fellowship to be had with a community of believers, the Holy Spirit has the power to make that place feel a little more like home. Thank you.